Hello and welcome to Application Fever, a video podcast where I'll discuss over-application and application inflation in medical residency training programs over the past few years, and suggest what we can do about it. So I put together this podcast at the suggestion of some of you who follow my blog or follow me on Twitter as a way of getting this message out to a bigger audience. And although I'm happy to do it, this is only the second video podcast I've ever put together, and so it's not going to be as technically polished as some of the other content out there. However, I appreciate your time and interest. So I saw my first case of application fever 3 years ago. There was a medical student who asked me to write a letter of recommendation for her internal medicine residency applications. Now, I'd worked with her on the wards, and she was easily in the top 10% of students that I'd worked with, and I was more than happy to write a letter for her. So I drafted some thoughts, but then, like I usually do, I asked her to come and meet with me and bring her CV so that I could make sure that I was hitting the high points of her application. And as we chatted and went over things, I casually asked her where she was planning to apply. And at that point, she reached into her bag and she pulled out a printed list of programs that was 2 pages long. I was flabbergasted. She explained to me that her primary advisor had told her that she needed to apply to 60 to 75 programs in internal medicine. Now, at this point, I started sort of working through this checklist in my head about why she would need to apply to so many programs. I started sort of gently asking, well, were your step scores okay? They were very good. Did you take time off from medical school? No. I even ended up asking her if she had a criminal record because I could not understand why someone would need to apply to so many programs. And I felt bad because she didn't have a criminal record or any other black mark on her application at all. She was every bit the good student that I thought she was. She'd just been infected by application fever. See, I applied to residency programs back in 2006, and back in them days, you just didn't apply to that many programs unless there was a darn good reason for it. I think I applied to maybe 10 or 12 programs, and that was actually across 3 different disciplines because I was a little bit undecided on doing pediatrics and ended up applying to programs in internal medicine and med peds as well before making my final decision. And like a lot of doctors, after I went through my own residency application and match process, I didn't really spend a whole lot of time studying match statistics or trends in applications each year. The idea that a strong candidate in a not so competitive discipline would need to apply to so many programs just astounded me. It shouldn't have, because here's what was going on with application trends since I graduated from medical school. What I'm showing you here are some data from ERIS, the Electronic Residency Application Service, from 2007 to 2018. The red curve is for international medical graduates, the blue curve is for U.S. graduates, and as you can see, there has been a steady upward trend in the number of applications submitted over the past 10 to 12 years. And yes, you are reading the y-axis correctly. The average number of residency applications submitted by a U.S. medical graduate in the year 2018 was 60. That is almost double what it was in 2007 when it was 32. International medical graduates submit even more applications. 136 was the average in 2018. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about application fever, and this is what I'm going to spend the rest of this podcast discussing. How did we get here? What are the costs of this situation that we're in? And most importantly, how do we get out from under this? So let's start with the first question. How did we get here? What is the etiology of application fever? Why is it the case that students now are submitting so many more applications than they did even just a few years ago? The answer may not be the one that you expect. Because sometimes when I talk about this and I ask, why are students submitting so many more applications now? Sometimes people look at me like I'm asking a dumb question. And they say, well, Dr. Carmody, you see, it's a lot harder to get into residency now than it used to be. Residency spots just haven't been increasing at the same rate that students are graduating medical school. It's fierce competition out there. It's only logical that students would have to apply to more applications. It's because the competition is really picking up. Well, is that supported by the data? Not really. Here are some NRMP data showing the match rate by applicant type over time. The three curves show the match rate for U.S. medical graduating seniors, U.S. citizen international medical graduates, and non-U.S. citizen international medical graduates. And what you can see is that these match rates have been pretty flat over time. In fact, for international medical graduates, there's actually been an improvement in match rates over the last 3 or 4 years. Those aren't really the trends you'd expect if it were true that competition for residency is just really heating up. Well, let's take a look at some other NRMP data. These graphs show longer-term trends in the number of applicants, which is the green curve, and the number of available residency positions available in the match, and these data go all the way back to 1952. What you should notice here is that ever since the early 1980s, there have been more applicants than there have been available residency positions. But if you look at trends since about 2005, which are the data that I was showing you for application fever, the disparity between the number of applicants and number of positions is really pretty stable. In fact, there's an upswing in available positions over the past couple of years. Another way of looking at these same data is to look at the number of positions available per applicant. And this is a plot of that over time. Again, this is taken from the NRMP. And what you'll notice here is that that dashed line, which corresponds to U.S. seniors, in 2019, we had 1.7 residency positions available for every graduating fourth-year medical student in the United States. That is almost an all-time high. It has never been that high since 1972. Back in 2007, when U.S. students were only applying to 32 programs apiece, there were 1.44 positions available per each student. We have more now. These data don't fit the narrative that the residency market is tightening. Even if you look at the total active applicants, you'll notice that things have been stable. That green curve is pretty flat from about 2005 until now, like I said, even with a slight uptick recently. In other words, application fever is not driven by a change in the basic number of residency positions and applicants. There's something more going on here. So we need to ask ourselves, why is it that this myth is so pervasive? Why do students feel like the residency marketplace is tightening, even in the absence of objective data to suggest that it is? So let's take a moment and think about what application fever means in both practical and psychological terms. And we'll use some real numbers here. In 2018, there were 171 orthopedic surgery residency programs that participated in the match, and they offered 742 individual positions. Altogether, there were 1,017 candidates who applied for those 742 positions. Now, if you're a student and you want to be an orthopedic surgeon, you can apply to every single program. You can apply to all 171 programs, and I'm sure some people do. But if you're an orthopedic surgery program director and all 1,017 candidates apply to your program, there's no way that you can interview them all. Now, as applications rise, you might try to squeeze in an extra interview day or strong arm your faculty into interviewing a couple of extra candidates each day that you do interviews. And there may be some programs that are interviewing quite a few more candidates than they were 10 years ago, but that increase definitely does not mirror the rise in applications per student. And what that means is that although applicants can apply to every program, programs can't interview every applicant. And that means that without a change in the number of candidates or the number of positions, as students apply to more programs, a smaller percentage of candidates are going to get interviewed by each program. And that contributes to a student perception that they need to apply to more and more and more programs. And what's even worse than that is that as programs receive more applications, the decisions about who to interview become less predictable. And applicants want predictability. They crave predictability. And when predictability in the application process is taken from them, they respond by applying to more and more programs. Let me give you a couple of examples about how predictability might be hindered by the current environment of application fever. Suppose you have a total rock star of an applicant who applies to a not so competitive program as more or less a safety. and he doesn't get offered an interview. Now, from the program standpoint, they're looking at this huge pile of applications and a limited number of interviews, and they say, look, this guy's not coming here. He's overqualified. He's just going to take an interview spot and then cancel on us at the last minute. Let's not even waste our time. But from the student standpoint, he's like, dude, that was my safety school. This process is so random. I got to apply to more programs because if I don't match at my top-notch places, I'm going to go unmatched here. Or here's another example. Suppose that you have a solid candidate who applies to 20 programs where their advisor says, look, you will be fine. You're going to be very competitive at these programs. And she gets interview offers at only a fraction of those 20. Even though on paper, those programs are completely indistinguishable. There's not any objective measure that would lead you to believe that you would get an interview at one and not the other. There's no rhyme or reason that the applicant can discern, and so she's going to apply to more programs to make sure that she has enough interviews to match. I mean, look, applying to programs is expensive, and I'm sure students have other things they could spend their money on. They wouldn't be applying to so many programs if they didn't feel like they didn't need to. There's an important relationship here between the predictability of the match and the number of applications that students submit. If they know they're going to match, they're not going to submit so many applications. But the problem is that the more applications that students submit, the more capricious the whole process seems. And in response, students submit even more applications to ensure they don't go unmatched. And when you repeat that process year after year, you get a graph that looks like those application trends that we looked at just a few slides back. There's an important accelerant that's probably fueling this fire as well that should be acknowledged, and that's the role of social media. Back when I applied to residency, which again wasn't that long ago, my only real source of information on how many programs I should apply to was my advisor and the deans. I mean, I could ask my classmates, but they were getting advice from the same people, and so I just did what they told me to do. Well, now students get information from a lot more sources. When you see that the people that you follow on Twitter or Instagram are getting interview offers, or maybe they're not getting interview offers, that has a powerful effect on you too. And even for students who are not on social media, their classmates are, and it allows things to spread much more quickly than it did a decade ago. And unfortunately, not all of the information on social media is accurate. I really enjoyed this tweet. Everyone on Student Doctor Network. I made AOA, but my Step 1 score is only 268, and none of my 6 first author publications are in Nature. Should I apply to 50 programs or 60? And if you think that's a trivial example, folks, you don't have any idea about the power of social media, especially in influencing comparisons. And of course, not all the information that's on social media is accurate. This tweet was actually retweeting and responding to a tweet of mine where I had pointed out a study from the Journal of the American College of Radiology highlighting applicants in radiation oncology. And unsurprisingly, those who post on these networks are much more likely to be in AOA or have higher Step 1 scores than candidates who don't have those things. And remember, it's the student perception of what their competition is in the residency selection process that drives their reality of how many applications to submit. I mean, remember, going unmatched after you've completed 4 years of medical school is a really bad outcome. Not being able to do the career that you want to do for the rest of your life, that's a really bad outcome. And so students have a powerful incentive to avoid that. In fact, modeling those incentives using game theory provides probably the best explanation for why application fever exists. Here's an illustration of how game theory applies to the number of applications that a student may choose to submit. This graphic is taken from a paper that was published in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education in 2015. It's an important paper because of two things. First, the authors showed using historical data that match rates do not improve when students submit more and more applications. And it's not just that they didn't find a statistically significant effect, it's that the estimate of the effect size was really clustered around the null hypothesis. The odds ratios were all clustered right around 1. But beyond that, the authors provided a compelling model for why the decision to over-apply, to apply to more programs than you need to, is a dominant strategy. And this is what's being shown here. The situation approximates the most famous situation in game theory, which is the prisoner's dilemma. And if you haven't looked at this kind of matrix before, let me walk you through it real quick. Basically, we have two players in the game. We have applicant A and applicant B. And each applicant can choose one of two strategies: to apply to an ideal number of programs or to overapply. Based on which strategy the two applicants choose, we have various outcomes. Now, remember that applicant A can't control applicant B's decision about how many applications to submit. Applicant A can only choose to overapply or apply to an ideal number of programs and vice versa. The goal of this game, just like in real life, is to avoid going unmatched and instead obtain a match in the specialty of your choice. Now, if applicant A chooses to submit the ideal number of applications, and so does applicant B, then both of them will have a 5% chance of going unmatched. That approximates the overall match rate for US seniors of about 94-95%. But notice that if applicant A chooses to apply to the ideal number of places at the same time that applicant B chooses to overapply, applicant B gains a relative advantage over applicant A. Applicant B would have only a 2% chance of going unmatched, while applicant A now has a 10% chance of going unmatched. Because, see, in the prisoner's dilemma and in real life, residency selection is a zero-sum game. There's only a fixed number of residency spots, and there's not enough of them for all the applicants. And while an individual applicant may win, their win is offset by another person's loss. There's no way of giving everyone what they want. So given that, let's think about what would happen if applicant A chooses to overapply. Well, if she overapplies at the same time that applicant B chooses to overapply, they both will have a 6% chance of not matching because of the chaos and decreased efficiency that comes when you have application fever. However, if applicant A overapplies and applicant B is dumb enough to not overapply, then applicant A can gain a relative advantage in this competition. And when you think about it this way, it becomes painfully obvious that overapplication is a rational and a dominant strategy. It's only by overapplying that applicant A has a chance of getting their best possible outcome, and it's only by overapplying that they get to avoid the possibility of having their worst possible outcome. In other words, every time you play the game, the applicant should choose to overapply. Application fever is not the student's fault. It's a natural consequence of this game that we've forced them to play, and we shouldn't expect them to choose any differently. But just because overapplying is a rational choice in this game, it doesn't mean that that choice is one without harm. Which brings us to Chapter 2, Costs and Beneficiaries of Application Fever. Remember, submitting all these applications costs real money, and it's expensive. Overapplying might be a dominant strategy, but that don't mean it's cheap. Here's the current ARAS fee schedule. As you can see, it's a tiered system. You get 10 applications for the low price of $99. The next 10 will cost you $14 a piece. The next 10 after that, $18 a piece. And if you're submitting 31 or more, each application above that threshold will cost you $26. So let's put this in real terms. Remember, if the average US senior is applying to 60 programs, then the fee schedule is going to work out like this. Applying to 60 programs is going to end up costing you $1,199. And bear in mind that the average international medical graduate is applying to twice as many as this. I didn't even bother to calculate it because I knew it would make me feel sad. And where does all that money go? Well, it goes to the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is the sponsor of ARAS. And so, as you can see from this chart, as applications have climbed, so too has the revenue generated by ARAS. These figures were obtained from the organization's publicly available IRS Form 990 tax documents. And as you can see here, revenue has more than doubled from 2008 to 2017, going from under $40 million to about $84 million in 2017. But it's not just that ARAS revenue is increasing. That growth has dramatically outpaced the growth in other AAMC programs, and that's what I'm showing you here. Each of these bars represents a different program within the AAMC. The red bars are ARAS, and you can see the trend that we saw in the previous slide. But let's compare that to the money that they generate from membership dues, which has been static over the past 10 years. Or what about, let's look at AMCAS, which is the application program that's used by students to apply to medical schools, which has grown much more modestly. Even MCAT revenues have gone up some, but nothing like what we've seen in ARIS with the onset of application fever. Now, every now and then when I present these kinds of financial data, someone will say to me, well, it doesn't matter. The AMC is a nonprofit organization. Why do you care about the money they make? Because they're a nonprofit. They can't make money. And this kind of thinking represents a fundamental misunderstanding about what a nonprofit organization means and what a nonprofit organization does. And so I'd like to take a moment just to clarify that here. A nonprofit organization does not have to pay tax on the money that it makes, like a for-profit corporation would, or like you and I do when we earn income. A nonprofit organization, however, can make a profit if they take in money in excess of what the services they provide cost. And in fact, all nonprofit organizations kind of have to turn a profit, because if they don't take in enough money to cover the cost of their expenses, then they go belly up and they don't exist anymore. So all nonprofit organizations have to make a profit. The question is what they can do with that profit, because a for-profit entity has the option of investing those monies in itself, or it can return some of them to its shareholders in the form of a dividend or something like that. Well, nonprofit organizations can't do that. If they take in money in excess of what their services cost, the only things they can do with that money are reinvest in more programs or in themselves with higher salaries and better compensation. And executives at the AMC, like some of the other big nonprofit organizations that we've looked at here on this podcast, they do pretty well for themselves. This is the current president of the AMC, Dr. Daryl Kirsch. In 2016, the total compensation he received was almost $2.2 million. Now, in pointing this out, I want to be very clear about something. My intent here is not to be ad hominem. Pointing out the salary is nothing against Dr. Kirsch, who makes a salary that's, to be fair, about the going rate for a CEO of an organization with revenues like the AMC has. But let's be honest, it's a lot of money. $2.2 million is a lot of money. It's more than enough to create a financial conflict of interest. And the issue with financial conflict of interest, as I've pointed out several times in the past, it doesn't imply deliberate malfeasance. It implies that there's an increasing possibility of implicit bias the more money is on the table. It's easier to see a situation in a certain light when seeing it that way keeps more money in your pocket. And that's a truism not just for executives at the AMC, it's a truism for you and for me and any one of us out there. There's not some kind of special superhuman that staffs nonprofit organizations and is completely immune from financial incentives. They're regular human beings just like you and me. And for regular human beings, money matters. And a constant 5 to 6% of the AMC's budget goes toward its executive salaries. And that means that as revenues climb at the organization, everyone's salary goes up. Now, there's one other cost of application fever that deserves special mention, and that's the relationship between the rising applications and the use of USMLE Step 1 for screening those applications. There's an evil synergy between application fever and Step 1 mania, and it's a topic that I've written about in the past. This screenshot is from my blog, and if you're interested in more on that, I would refer you there. But suffice to say this, application fever almost necessitates the use of a broad numeric measure to screen out applications. It's very hard for program directors to receive thousands of applications for a handful of spots. It's hard to blame them for turning to a metric like that. At the same time, the availability of Step 1 scores enable applications to rise higher and higher and higher. Do you think program directors would have stood by idly as they had to review and read thousands and thousands of applications? No way. They would have stood up long before now and said, hey, this system isn't working, guys. We got to do something different here. Step 1 enables application fever, and application fever necessitates the use of Step 1 scores. These are related phenomena, both of which impose harmful externalities on medical education and medicine in general. And the primary beneficiary of both of these trends is not students, and it's not program directors, and it's not medical education. The primary beneficiary of both of these phenomena is their corporate sponsors. But before I get too lathered up talking about USMLE Step 1, let's get back to the topic at hand, which today is application fever. Let's move on to Chapter 3. What's the solution for this? What's the antipyretic for application fever? And here what I'd like to do is walk you through a variety of possible strategies that we could use to get rid of application fever. And for each strategy, what I want to do is think critically about why it might work, what good could come from it, but then also what harms could it create and what unintended consequences might arise as a result of implementing such a policy. So for each strategy we discuss, we'll talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, all of the individual strategies that we're going to think about fall under one of two big, broad categories. And the first one that we're going to consider are caps. So imposing limits, capping something in the residency selection process to gain control of the system again. And the simplest and most straightforward thing to cap are applications themselves. So instead of our current system where students can apply to whatever number of programs they want, we impose a limit and say you can only apply to, say, 20 programs, and that's it. Because the thing is, people don't need to apply to so many programs. Remember, match outcomes are statistically indistinguishable today from those 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when students were applying to many fewer programs. So if outcomes are the same, why don't we just go back to the number of programs that people were applying to back in those days? To make the point that students don't need to apply to so many programs, I'm going to show you some data from the NRMP. Now, these data are for U.S. medical graduates, allopathic seniors, and what you see here is on the y-axis is the probability of matching in this specialty versus the number of ranks that a candidate assigned. And as you can see, for a candidate applying in internal medicine, if you assign 5 ranks, you've got a better than 90% chance of matching. You assign 10 ranks, you've got essentially a 100% chance of matching. Now again, these are NRMP data, not ARIS data. So the x-axis is number of ranks, not number of applications submitted. And to rank a program, it means you've got to have done an interview there. But I'm showing you these charts to make the point that instead of just submitting 60 or 80 applications all over the dang place, applicants could submit 20 carefully chosen applications, interview at 10 places, and have a very high probability of success in the match. Now, some of you out there might be saying, well, internal medicine, that's not a competitive specialty. What about more competitive specialties than that? So I put in a couple of others just to demonstrate that this relationship holds for most specialties. Here, for example, is emergency medicine. So if you submit just 5 ranks in emergency medicine, your chance of matching successfully is only about 60%. But again, just like we saw in internal medicine, once you get to 10 ranks, you've got a better than 90% chance of matching in emergency medicine, which has been a much hotter specialty in the past few years. Here, for example, is dermatology, one of the most difficult specialties to match in for U.S. seniors. And again, once you get to 10 ranks, you're above 90% chance of matching. Even for orthopedic surgery, when you get to 10 ranks, you've got an 80% chance of matching. You get to about 15, you're up to about 95%. And again, the point here is not anything about orthopedic surgery or dermatology or internal medicine or anything like that. The point is that U.S. seniors do not need to apply to as many programs as they're currently applying to. Now, I know some people out there are saying, well, what about international medical graduates? What about the people who are applying to 130 programs? Surely they need to apply to that many. So let's think a little bit more about IMGs. What I'm showing you here are some data that I pulled from the NRMP's Charting Outcomes for International Medical Graduates report in 2018. And I'm showing you the specialties into which international medical graduates actually matched. As you can see, the distribution is quite different than the distribution of specialties for U.S. medical graduates. And these data apply, I pooled data for both U.S. citizen and non-U.S. citizen IMGs. The takeaway here is that over 50% of all IMGs who successfully match in internal medicine. 75% of IMGs match in either internal medicine, family medicine, or pediatrics. The remaining 25% is cleaved up between neurology, anesthesia, and pathology, with increasingly smaller numbers of people getting down into the single digits for competitive surgical specialties. And on the right side of this distribution, the numbers are so small that I think it's difficult to make valid inference. But let's take a look at the chart for match outcomes by rank list for internal medicine, since that applies to over half of all successfully matched IMGs. And what we see is that this chart, the probability of matching in your specialty by the number of ranks, it looks almost identical to the chart for US medical graduates. Once you've gotten to about 10 contiguous ranks, you have a better than 90% chance of successfully matching in internal medicine. And this applies to both US citizen and non-US citizen IMGs. To be perfectly clear, again, these are showing ranks, not number of applications submitted. And I know there are people out there that will say, well, this cap will not work because we apply to 130 programs so that we can get 10 interviews. But again, I don't think you necessarily need to apply to 130 places. The reason you need to apply to 130 places is because everybody's applying to 130 places. And 110 of them throw the application in the trash and don't even look at it. So did you need to apply to that 110? I don't know, probably not. So from my standpoint, the good thing about application caps is very clear. If we had caps, application fever is over. There would be an external control on the number of applications that candidates can submit. So should we just go ahead and do application caps? I don't know, maybe not. There's some bad things too. First, there's something that seems sort of un-American about caps. We live in a country where your individual freedom shouldn't be curtailed without a good reason for doing so. And we live in a country also where we hold as principle, for better or worse, that you should be allowed to have as much of something as you have money to pay for it. Now, you can make the argument that the residency training system itself is un-American. After all, it's a monopoly where the participants do not have the ability to negotiate the contracts for which they're going to work. And in fact, in the mid-2000s, there was a class action lawsuit that probably would have overturned the residency training system as we know it on the basis of antitrust law, had Congress not intervened and specifically written into the US Code an exclusion from antitrust for the residency training system. If you're interested in learning more about that story, I do have a link on my blog to some articles about it. Now, a second bad thing is that students need data to choose programs. Like I showed you before, students don't need to apply to so many. I mean, they need to rank maybe 10 programs in order to have a very high likelihood of matching. But the question is, how are students going to figure out which programs they need to rank? Where are they a good fit? And unfortunately, in the face of application fever, the information provided by programs to students has become very generic. I could show you websites for different residency training programs, and I'll bet you I could switch the names and you wouldn't even know the difference because the information provided by every program looks the same. Beyond just distinguishing programs, which often seem interchangeable, and it leaves students looking at just geographic location and US News and World Report rankings to decide which programs they're interested in. But beyond that, students get very little quality information about programs where they're actually competitive. They have to rely on their deans or social media or word of mouth to try to figure out, hey, do I actually have a shot at matching this program or not? And unfortunately, if we're going to move to a cap-based system, you can't just leave it to applicants to look at websites at the current residents and try to speculate about where they might fall and if that's a good program to burn one of their precious applications on or not. That's really just not going to work. And in light of that, if we move to a cap-based system, I think we have to be prepared that there's likely going to be a reduction in the match rates, at least transiently, as we get all this worked out. And we'd have to be prepared to support candidates and programs through a fair and efficient SOAP process. The bottom line for me is that caps have a lot of promise. They could get us out of this problem, but we're going to need to fix some other issues to make it work well. So what other ideas are there? Well, another idea is that programs could have caps. In other words, programs could receive only a limited number of applications. If a program director says he's only got the time to read and provide a detailed review for 200 applications, that's cool. ARIS will stop sending you applications once you hit your cap. So the good thing about a program cap system is that it's likely to result in holistic review. If you give program directors only a number of applications that they can seriously consider, then they'll seriously consider them, especially if they know that their incoming class has to come out of that allotment that they've received. The bad thing is, how are we going to figure out whose applications get into the pile? That is, let's say that a program is capped at receiving 200 applications, but there's 1,000 people who want to apply to it. Are we going to use a first come, first serve approach? If we do, I think we can anticipate the consequences of that. The day that ARIS opens, the computer system's going to crash as everybody tries to get their applications in as fast as they possibly can. There will be the expected wailing and gnashing of teeth. But even worse, there's no guarantee that the people who apply first will be the applications that programs really want to receive. And if program directors don't get applications from the candidates that they really want, then they'll demand that their cap be increased. And if multiple programs do that, then after a period of time, we're right back where we started. I'm not convinced that program caps are going to be a long-term solution. So a third option would be to provide caps on interviews. And the way this would work is that you can apply to as many programs as you want, but you can only accept a limited number of interview offers. At first glance, there's something very appealing about this idea. After all, program directors don't really want to have to roll out the red carpet for candidates that aren't really that interested in the program. So giving candidates a limited number of interviews would ensure that the people who you actually are interviewing have more interest in your program. Capping interviews would probably also address one frustrating problem for many programs, and that is late or even last-minute interview cancellations. Because when candidates are over-applying, they often over-accept interview offers and then cancel them at the last minute, which makes those spots very difficult to fill, and it places a drag on the whole system for everyone. However, if the number of interviews that you could do was capped, candidates would have an incentive to complete every single one of those interviews to maximize their possibility of matching successfully. What I like about interview caps is the idea that limiting interviews to the most interested candidates is really a benefit for everyone. What I don't like is that if we do this, the whole system is going to be moving at the pace of the slowest program. Because today, programs all have their own individual calendars for reviewing applications and issuing invitations to interview. But if we place a cap on the number of interviews, candidates would rightfully be a little bit nervous about accepting or declining an early offer to interview before they'd heard back from all the other programs to which they'd applied. They'll probably want to sit on those offers until they know exactly who's offering them so that they can make a sensible selection about which of these offers do they actually want to take. And that means that whatever programs are the slowest to conduct their reviews are going to limit the pace of the system for everybody else. Still, a more serious problem with interview caps is that it's probably going to do next to nothing to address application fever. I think that candidates probably are more or less limiting their number of interviews now. I mean, you can apply to 100 programs if you want, but I'd like to see you try to pull off 100 interviews. Candidates are applying to a lot of programs to ensure they have enough interview offers, but then for the most part, I think candidates across the board are interviewing at pretty much the right number of programs for themselves. The reality of time and space constrains that. So we can cap interviews, but program directors are still going to be buried under a giant pile of applications to even figure out who they should offer interviews to. So at this point, we've talked about 3 different kinds of caps, but caps aren't the only way that we could try to break application fever. Rather than imposing some kind of external limit on the market, we could allow the market to work, but change the incentives. we could try to make it easier for candidates to apply to an appropriate number of programs and harder for them to apply to more programs than they need to. So for part 2, let's consider some marketplace incentives that we might use to try to fix application fever. One thing we could try is that old tool of government, taxes. We could tax excess applications. And the idea there is that if we significantly increase the cost of applications beyond a certain threshold, then that will modify people's behavior. We use taxes in lots of ways, even in public health. Think about, for example, taxes on a pack of cigarettes. When you make it more expensive to smoke, fewer people will do it. And if we made the cost of excess application prohibitive, over application, we would expect it to decrease. The trouble is, the cost would really have to be prohibitive. Those taxes are going to have to be pretty steep because a rational candidate is going to be comparing the cost of the tax to the cost of going unmatched. I mean, what's the cost of having a 4-year medical degree and then not being able to secure residency training? Pretty steep. What's the cost of not being able to match in the specialty of your dreams for the rest of your life? Pretty steep. So a rational candidate will continue to apply regardless of what the tax is, unless that cost is greater than their expected losses of going unmatched. Second, it's worth pointing out that we're kind of doing this already. Remember a few slides ago, I showed you the current ARS fee schedule? And remember that when you submit 31 or more applications, you're paying 2.6 times essentially what you paid for your first 10 applications. And yet, here you sit listening to a podcast about application fever. So that tiered system has really done nothing to blunt the rise in applications. Lastly, the ugly part of a tax is that it impacts some applicants more than others. I mean, suppose we jacked up the highest tier ARIS applications to, $50 an application, $100 an application, $500 an application. Some people will certainly be priced out of that market. But the people who are priced out are disproportionately going to be people with lower financial resources. But if you're extremely wealthy, that tax is not going to matter so much to you. I mean, if you're a multimillionaire, spending that on applications is kind of like me deciding to buy a breakfast biscuit on the way to work. And because a tax is more motivating to people who have less financial resources, I think we have to be a little bit thoughtful about implementing something like that. We hear a lot about rising medical student loan debt. In fact, in 2018, the median medical student loan debt for graduating students was $200,000. But what you don't hear about quite so much is that the distribution of student loan indebtedness is a bimodal distribution. It's true that the mean and the median for students who take out loans is increasing and has been increasing for many years. But it's also true that the percentage of students who graduate medical school with zero student loan debt has also been increasing. In fact, in 2018, 25% of students graduated with no debt at all. And as a side note, it seems that student loan indebtedness does impact career selection. What I'm showing you here is a figure from a paper in JAMA Internal Medicine a few years ago, and it shows the distribution of various student loan categories in a number of medical specialties. Here, those dark green bars represent the proportion of students who have zero student loan debt, and it's different across specialties. In ophthalmology, for example, 40% of residents have no medical student loan debt. On the other hand, family medicine has the lowest percentage of students with no loan debt. Now, there's lots of explanations for that are possible, but one is that having no loan debt provides an advantage in attending interviews or doing away rotations or other things that are beneficial when you're trying for a competitive residency. So I think we should be careful. I think we should be careful about setting up a system that rewards financial advantage in a system like residency selection, where really what we're trying to achieve is a meritocracy, and it really shouldn't matter in theory how much loans you have or how much money your family has. We really want to select the best candidates, and I'm not sure that a tax is going to further that goal. A second approach that we could try to smooth out the market would be to increase the amount of information available to program directors. So I call this application transparency. The idea here would be that program directors would be able to see the list of other programs to which an applicant was applying. Currently, that information is secret. When you apply to a program, that program director doesn't have a clue whether you applied to 5 programs or 75. But the idea is that with that information, program directors could make smarter decisions about who to offer interviews to. After all, if you're a program director and you see that an applicant has applied to 150 programs, you probably know they have a little bit less interest in your program versus anyone else. And if program directors interview people like that a little bit less often, then students will have an incentive to apply to fewer programs or to make a more rational program list if they were, in a sense, punished by program directors by over-applying. I think the good thing about this is that in some cases, at least, providing this information to program directors will allow them to identify candidates who really probably aren't going to come there. In a sense, it seems strange to ask program directors to make this kind of decision, but to be honest, gone are the days where simply submitting an application was sufficient to show that you were truly interested in going there. We're now in the era of application fever. To me, the best thing about application transparency would be its potential to reduce one of the most wasteful types of over-application, and that is well-qualified candidates who apply to multiple different specialties. I've highlighted before these ARIS cross-specialty applicant data, but I'll say again, they're getting pretty ridiculous. There's been an increasing trend for candidates to apply not just to one specialty, but to a variety of specialties as a backup. So this matrix is provided by ARIS, and each cell here shows the number of applicants who applied in a particular combination of specialties in the year 2018. So for instance, if we look across at, let's say, anesthesiology, we can see that 159 applicants applied in both anesthesia and dermatology. 121 applied in anesthesia and psychiatry. And maybe those 121 people are just truly torn about how they want to impact the confluence of anesthesia and mental health. Or maybe, perhaps more likely, those candidates are applying to one of those specialties as a backup. Or, for example, we could look at the number of applicants who applied in general surgery and radiology. There were 128. 128 students who can't decide whether they want to spend their career in the operating room or a dark room looking at films. Or, like I said, more likely these are people applying as a backup. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with people applying to a particular specialty that's very competitive and applying to a backup specialty. There's really nothing wrong with that. And similarly, I don't think there's anything wrong with people applying to multiple specialties when they're truly undecided. As I mentioned before, I actually applied in a few different specialties in internal medicine, med peds, and pediatrics because I was honestly undecided. But I think we also have to be honest about what many of the numbers on this matrix reflect, and that's just a different kind of over-application. And the potential of application transparency is that we could reduce that, because if a program director sees that you're applying to his dermatology program and also programs in otolaryngology and radiology and oncology, I think it's a fair question to ask, how interested are you really in being here? And maybe if they don't want to offer you an interview because of that lack of interest or that perceived lack of interest, then students will have an incentive to not do that particular type of over-application any longer. There are some downsides to application transparency, though. After all, shame doesn't work if everybody's doing it. The idea here is that some candidates would be a little bit ashamed about applying to so many programs and would curtail their behavior. But if they don't, and if all applicants continue to apply to 60, 70, 80, 100 programs, what is there to be shamed about? Everybody's doing it. How are you any different than anyone else? Secondly, would program directors really use this data? When I talk about the USMLE score reporting policy and suggest that we could get by with a pass-fail test, I frequently hear from program directors that claim with a straight face that they have no more time to review applications than they have to sort them by USMLE Step 1 scores and ARIS. So they're really going to critically scrutinize a list of 80 programs to discern an applicant's intention or motivation to enter that specialty? That seems a little bit doubtful. Also, even if a program director wanted to use this information, they would have a limited ability to do so. They could use it for screening and decide to not even offer an interview to a candidate. But if they were interviewing someone, they wouldn't be allowed to discuss this kind of stuff because right now it's considered a match violation to discuss other programs to which a candidate is applying. So even if a residency program director were interviewing someone for her not so competitive internal medicine program and she noticed that the candidate was applying to 3 other lifestyle specialties, she wouldn't be allowed to hold that candidate's feet to the fire and ask them what they were doing. And to be honest, that's probably a good thing. I mean, we don't want to create a system that encourages candidates to be bullied. We just want to encourage sensible behavior. The ugly side of application transparency is that it will probably disproportionately eliminate people's safety programs. After all, if a candidate is applying to a bunch of competitive programs and one non-competitive program, the program director at that non-competitive program might rightfully look at them and say, this person's not coming here. We don't even need to waste our time interviewing them. But at the same time, that's the program that may be needed if those other programs decline to rank the candidate highly. And if we eliminate people's safety programs, we'll really just make a more chaotic system that has a lower match rate. So I'm not convinced that application transparency is what we need. I don't really think it's likely to work. And if it does work, it may work out in a way that's not really what we want. So a third way we could try to make the marketplace work better is by using secondary applications. That is, allowing individual programs to impose small, additional application requirements. And the idea here is that we would make it more difficult to over-apply. Because, one reason we didn't have application fever 30 years ago is because it was really cumbersome to apply to a ton of programs. You had to collect paper applications and individual application requirements and mail these things out all over the country. It was time consuming and it imposed a limit. Even if you wanted to try to apply to 60 or 80 or 100 programs, it would have been really hard to do so. But in 1996, we had ERIS, and ERIS has been refined since then, and with this electronic system, it becomes very easy to apply to as many programs as your heart desires with just a point and a click and a credit card. There are some data to suggest that this approach would work. In this paper here from JAMA Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery, a competitive otolaryngology program imposed just a small essay requirement. Just tell us why you're interested in this program. And just doing that decreased applications by 25%. And in a way, the very candidates that you're screening out, the very people who are unwilling to write a short essay, those are the very people who aren't going to be coming to your program anyway. Those are the very people that program directors want to screen out. One bad thing, though, is that students aren't going to like it. It's already time-consuming and burdensome to apply to residency programs, and if every program starts imposing these secondary applications, it's only going to become more time-consuming and burdensome. But to me, the real issue with secondary applications is that it's likely to be a temporary fix. You can imagine, even if every program starts imposing these side application requirements, it won't take students too long to realize that the more of those little side applications that they get completed and the more applications they submit, the more of a relative advantage they'll enjoy against their peers in a competitive matching process. And we'll be right back where we started. In fact, we may be a little bit worse than where we started because all these little side applications are going to be time consuming and students will complete them, but it will come at the cost of activities that are potentially more educationally valuable. I've been very critical in the past about Step 1 mania, about how the over-focus on preparation for USMLE Step 1 is hurting medical education. But I'm not sure that side application mania will be much better. So let's take a look at a fourth marketplace intervention, preference signaling. With preference signaling, candidates would be able to designate a small number of programs, say 1 or 2 or 3, as their priorities when they submit their applications. And in a way, preference signaling gets at one of the biggest problems that arises in an era of application fever, and that is that when candidates submit 60 or 70 applications, it's not at all clear which are the programs they really want to match at. And if programs had a way of knowing which candidates really wanted to match there, they might deservingly give those candidates priority in offering interviews. So the hope with preference signaling is that it will smooth out the marketplace. After all, if students have a way of showing program directors the places that they're really interested in, the places they really want to match, and program directors act on that information to give those candidates interviews, then maybe students wouldn't have to apply to so many places. And in fact, this paper from the Journal of Graduate Medical Education did a computer simulation of this very idea and showed that it might work. Unfortunately, despite the thoughtful analysis in the paper, I'm very skeptical that this would work long term. To me, an approach like this is very susceptible to being gamed by students. After all, from a student perspective, if you're deciding where to submit your priority applications, you'll quickly realize that those provide the most value to you if you submit them to your REACH programs, places where you might not have gotten an interview otherwise. If you submit them to places where you were already going to get an interview on your own merit, you've really not bettered your situation. So students will quickly realize that the priority applications need to be submitted to the most selective, most elite program to which they're applying. And pretty soon, that priority designation will lose all of its meaning in signaling preference. It will just become a sign of whatever program has the higher U.S. News and World Report ranking. And given all that, I think there's some risk in using this preference signaling approach. Because if we go to a tiered application system where we have special applications and regular applications, the value of regular applications may be further devalued. And if the value of each application is less, then you're going to need to submit more of them. And paradoxically, an approach like this, where we have special and regular applications, may actually result in students submitting more regular applications. Not exactly what we're trying to encourage if we're trying to address application fever. So at this point, we've discussed a number of approaches that could be used to try to address application fever, and clearly none of them are perfect. All of them have some downsides and some likely unintended consequences that we would have to be prepared to deal with. So this brings me to chapter 4 of our talk, my prescription. What would I do for application fever? So the more I've thought about it, the more I think we need hard application caps. Instead of allowing students to submit as many applications as they want or as many as they can afford, we need to restore fairness and sanity to the system by setting a limit on this behavior. This strategy is informed, again, by the fact that students do not need to apply to as many programs as they are currently applying to in order to enjoy a high match rate. Again, match rates have not improved in the face of application fever. So what we're going to do is we're going to reset the clock back to a few years ago when students were applying to fewer programs and had exactly the same match rate. And for those who say this won't work, that they need to apply to 100 programs in order to get a handful of interviews, let me reiterate again, the reason that students have to apply to 100 programs to get a handful of interviews is because everyone's applying to 100 programs. It's a nonsensical system that has no logical end unless we impose one. Personally, I think that for caps to be fair, they have to apply essentially across the board to every applicant in every specialty. There are people who have suggested using specialty-specific application caps, letting people who are applying in competitive specialties, for example, apply to more places. I'm not really a fan of that, at least at this point. I feel like, we live in a free country. You have the right to choose what you want to do and how you want to live your life. But with that freedom comes the responsibility of living with the consequences of your decisions. And so if you're a student and you decide that you want to maximize your chance of matching at highly selective programs or specialties, you can spend every one of your applications applying to those specialties and programs. That's fine. But you need to be prepared to live with the consequences that you may go unmatched if that strategy doesn't work. And if that results in fewer people applying in orthopedics and dermatology, I'm not really sure that we're going to be worse off as a society because we have more people who want to go into those specialties than we need. Now, having said that, there are some groups that may need some extra applications. Couples, for example, they probably do need an increase in their application cap in order to match fairly. International medical graduates, at least initially, may need some additional applications to ensure the same match rate. And to ensure that the marketplace has time to adjust, I think that caps should probably be phased in. It shouldn't happen overnight that we go from applying to 60 or 80 programs down to just 20. We have data, like I've shown you, to suggest how many programs a person needs to apply to, and so I think that should be our target, but we can ratchet down the number of applications from the average down toward that target over a couple of years. Now, for CAPS to work, there's one thing that absolutely has to happen, and that is better signaling from programs to applicants. Applicants need to know, where are they competitive? Where are they likely to match? What programs are honestly a good fit for them? If we do not provide that information, the system is not going to work. And right now, to be frank, we are not providing that information. In some specialties in the past, there has been a push to report information in a standardized way on program websites. And that's been resisted by program directors who are concerned that if their numbers don't look as good as their competitors, that fewer top applicants will apply to their program. And from my standpoint, that is just something that we're going to have to push through. Programs need to articulate a vision of who they're trying to train and what's unique about their program, and recruit people on the basis of that, and then use these selection metrics as a way for applicants to decide, oh, I love the mission of that program, but am I really competitive? Programs need to move away from the idea that they're so generic that the only way that programs can be compared is on the basis of their USMLE scores for their entering classes. It may also help applicants to have information in real time about how many other applications the program has received, so that if you're down to your last couple of applications, you could see, oh gosh, this program hasn't gotten as many applications as this other one. I probably am better off using this for my last application. And providing that kind of information would provide a benefit both to programs and applicants in preventing the program from being unfilled or applicants from going unmatched. Still, even if we do all of this, even if we phase in CAPS, even if we have better signaling, there's a risk that the match rate may decline, and that there will at least be a slight increase in the number of programs that go unfilled and the number of candidates that go unmatched, at least initially. And so to support those people, we need to streamline the SOAP process. We need software that works. We may need a longer time frame to allow more careful evaluation. We sort of need to destigmatize that entire process. We could call it second wave applications or something else. But we would need to be prepared to support both programs and candidates with a SOAP process that actually works well. So what do you think? Do you like my prescription or not? Well, either way, it kind of doesn't matter because I have zero power to implement any of those changes. I'm just the guy talking about these things. So who does? Who has the power to change the system? Who's the hero that we need? That brings us to Chapter 5. There are a few different groups that are positioned to potentially impact this debate. Medical schools or undergraduate medical education, students, ARIS or the American Association of Medical Colleges, and program directors or in a broader sense, graduate medical education. So out of these four groups, who has the most power to impact this situation? So let's think it through one by one, starting with medical schools. Unfortunately, I think medical schools have very limited ability to impact this situation in a meaningful way. Other than a few deans who sit on influential committees, the medical school system is really on the outside of the match process. So if the schools are out, what about students? What can medical students do? After all, it's the students that are being plundered by the AAMC as application fever increases each year. Unfortunately, as a political entity, students have very limited power. They're busy, they have limited financial resources, and there's a turnover every couple of years. And organizations in power know that if you just sort of wait them out, the students will dissipate. They'll go on into their residencies and careers and forget about whatever issue they were fired up about. Beyond that, as I pointed out, students have an incentive to keep application fever going. Remember the game theory that we discussed? By over-applying, students maximize their own self-interest in obtaining a residency spot. So for all those reasons, I don't really think that students are the hero that we need. So if not students and not schools, what about the Association of American Medical Colleges, the sponsor of the Electronic Residency Application Service, ARIS? After all, it's their product. If they decided to impose caps and all of a sudden the website wouldn't let you apply to more than a certain number of places, we'd all have to go along with it. Now, of course, the AMC wouldn't do that unilaterally. They always solicit input from other stakeholder groups. And even more unfortunate than that, as I highlighted earlier in this talk, the AMC has a significant financial conflict of interest, and that makes it very easy to see this situation through a particular lens and to think that the product that you're providing is what the market's demanding. Students want more applications. We got to do it. Program directors, they don't want to go unfilled. We've got to do it. There are other ways, but unfortunately, I think the AMC has a financial incentive to not see it in those ways. So that leaves program directors and graduate medical education. What can they do? Do they have any power to impact application fever? Well, if you ask me, I think that program directors are the hero that we need. The funny thing is, when I've talked about this online, for instance, I've gotten a lot of pushback on Twitter from program directors who say, "Are you crazy? We have no power in this. All we do is get applications when they come in and put on our galoshes and wade through it. We don't control how many programs students apply to. We don't control ERAS. We're victims in all this." Now, there's a part of that argument that I do agree with, and that's that program directors are victims in all this. Application fever does not benefit them one bit. As I pointed out multiple times, match rates do not improve. There's no advantage that program directors gain when applicants overapply to the extent that they are. True fact, in 2018, the average internal medicine residency program received 2,200 residency applications. That's like 100 applications for every position they're trying to fill, and that's in internal medicine. Folks, we do not need this. Program directors are the main victim here. And it is true, they don't have any power. They're not in control of ERAS, and they don't control students. But while they don't have power in this situation, they do have leverage. Let me tell you what I mean. Imagine that instead of just complaining about application fever, or instead of just using convenience metrics to survive application season, suppose that program directors actually stood together and demanded change. See, every specialty has a professional group of program directors, a professional organization that represents them. And imagine that that organization went to the AMC and said, "Look guys, we're dying here. You got to fix application fever. This is not sustainable, and we're not going to keep doing it. You guys have 3 years to fix this problem. If you don't come up with a meaningful solution, then we're going to walk." And when we say we're going to walk, let me be very clear about what we're going to do. We're going to stop accepting ERAS applications for our group of programs, for our entire specialty. We're going to do it ourselves. So you got 3 years to fix this. If you don't, we're going to walk. What do you think would happen then? Remember, the AMC has an incentive to maintain application fever, and they will continue to have a financial incentive to maintain the status quo unless doing nothing is going to cost them more than actually doing something about it. And the threat of one or more specialties saying we're going to pull out from ERAS and use our own electronic application system, I think that's a meaningful threat. Now, when I've suggested this strategy, some people have been very skeptical about it. They've said, well, we could go to ERAS and the AMC. They're very receptive to us. We have a good working relationship. We could do that part of it. But we can't tell them that we're going to walk because they'll know that's a false threat. They'll know we're just blowing smoke. And I say, why? And they say, well, but it's ERAS. It's the Electronic Residency Application Service. We can't possibly replace that. And I say, guys, ERAS is good and all, but it's neither unique nor irreplaceable. It's a secure website. I don't know if you've been on the World Wide Web lately, but lots of people have them. And if each of your applicants is spending $1,200, you can't tell me that each specialty doesn't have enough money coming in to pay someone to make a different secure website through which applications could be submitted and through which you could impose whatever application cap you wanted. And let's not forget, ERAS is not perfect. Folks, it was only a few months ago that the ERAS website crashed repeatedly during SOAP Week, the 1 week of the year where ERAS needs to work flawlessly, and there was substantial downtime, and applicants and programs were pulling their hair out. I'm not so sure that a third-party private alternative wouldn't be better anyhow. And with that, we come to the end of application fever. And I hope by this point in the talk that a few of you have been convinced that we probably need application caps. Or maybe there's a few of you out there who now believe that program directors really hold the key to making a better system. But even if I haven't convinced you of those things, because look, I'm not saying I have the answers to everything, but even if I haven't convinced you of those things, I hope that I've convinced you at least of this. Application fever is not a good phenomenon. It's not benefiting us, and it's not going to go away on its own. Because of the incentives involved, this process will continue until such a time that we choose to address it. And I hope that time is soon. So if you like this podcast, if you care about these issues, please, if you're not following me on Twitter, follow me. I'm at JB Carmody, JBCARMODY. I also post a lot of the information that is included in this talk is already posted on my website, thesheriffofsodium.com. Thanks again for listening.